Have you ever walked into a room and felt judged before you even said a word? Not because you were loud, not because you broke any rules, but simply because of how you looked. What if the person everyone assumed didn't belong was actually the one in charge? And what if the moment they found out was too late to take it back? This isn't just a story about a courtroom. It's a story about what happens when assumptions meet authority and when quiet dignity becomes a storm no one saw coming. In today's story, you'll witness a powerful moment where everything changes, the glance that sparked a confrontation, the silence that revealed a system's flaws, and the badge that rewrote the rules. We'll take you inside a county courtroom where a black woman entered without a uniform and walked out as a symbol of justice. You'll meet the officer who didn't ask questions, the crowd that stayed silent, and the sheriff who never raised her voice but changed everything. But before we step into that room, I want you to ask yourself something. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever had to prove your worth just to be seen? If so, this story is for you. And if not, maybe it's time to listen a little closer. Let's begin. It was a Tuesday morning like any other. The kind where the courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee, and the echo of shoes on marble floors felt like part of the daily ritual. The courtroom was half full, lawyers shuffling case files, a bailiff murmuring directions, and a few spectators whispering in the gallery. It was quiet, predictable, almost peaceful. And then she walked in, a black woman, mid-30s, plain navy blazer slacks, no visible badge, no flashing credentials. No one knew her name. No one asked, but everyone made up their mind. Some glanced up and looked away. Others stared just long enough to say, "She doesn't look like she belongs here." No one said it aloud. They didn't have to. The room didn't grow louder. It grew sharper with the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something to go wrong. A silence packed with polite assumptions and unspoken rules. She moved with confidence, but even that seemed to make some people uneasy. She wasn't fumbling with papers, wasn't looking for directions. She knew exactly where she was going. And that, somehow, was threatening. One clerk leaned in to whisper to another. A defense attorney looked up from his brief, squinting. The deputy by the door stiffened. To them, she was probably just another defendant, or maybe someone looking for the wrong courtroom. Because in their world, authority didn't usually look like her. Not without a uniform. Not without an introduction. Not without permission. But here's the thing about assumptions: they say more about the person making them than the person they're aimed at. And in that moment, the assumptions in that courtroom weren't just casual. They were systemic. They were inherited. They were rehearsed. This wasn't just about one woman walking into a room. It was about how an entire room had been trained consciously or not to read power a certain way, a certain look, a certain voice, a certain skin tone. And because she didn't fit their version of authority, they saw her as disruption. It reminds me of a story I once heard about a judge in Michigan, an elderly white man who watched a black woman enter his court and was about to ask her to leave, until she walked straight to the bench beside him. She was the co-judge for that morning. He never admitted it, but people in the courtroom remembered how red his face turned. Bias doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just assumes, quietly, comfortably, until it's forced to confront the truth. And that's what makes this part of the story so important. Because before any confrontation, before any badge was revealed or voices raised, there was silence. And in that silence lived centuries of prejudice pretending to be protocol. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room isn't what's said, it's what's never questioned. And in just a few moments, that silence, it's going to break. Because what none of them knew was who she really was. Let's keep going. Celeste Morgan had worn a badge for 12 years. She'd pinned it on through hurricanes, riots, night shifts, and press briefings. It had been her armor and her voice, especially in rooms where no one expected her to speak. But that morning, she left it at home. No uniform. No radio clipped to her hip. No polished boots or embroidered rank. Just her, in plain clothes, as if she wanted the world to meet the woman before meeting the title. Some might call that risky. In her line of work, it certainly was. But for Celeste, it was intentional. She wanted to walk through that courthouse not as Sheriff Morgan, but as Celeste, the daughter of a school teacher, the sister who raised her younger brothers, the woman who had once stood on the other side of the justice system. Not as a law enforcer, but as a victim. She knew what it felt like to be questioned for simply existing in a space, to be asked, "Who are you here to see?" when all she wanted was to be seen. So she decided just this once to leave the uniform behind and see how far she could walk without it. Turns out, not very far. Because the world still reads uniforms like they read headlines fast, shallow, and often wrong. In a system obsessed with symbols, badges, robes, titles, ranks, Celeste became invisible the moment she removed hers. And that's the part that stings. Because if respect only arrives when the badge does, was it ever really respect to begin with? It brings to mind an old story from Chicago. A black female detective off duty and in jeans tried to help break up a street altercation. Uniformed officers pulled their guns on her. They didn't ask for ID. They didn't ask for her name. They only saw her skin and assumed. That detective, she later told a reporter, "It's not the badge that protects me. It's whether or not they believe I have one." And that belief for Celeste was absent the second she walked into that courtroom without the expected uniform. But here's the quiet truth: power that depends on costumes isn't real power. It's perception. And when perception fails, what remains is the person underneath. So when the officer grabbed her arm, barked orders, and demanded answers, he wasn't confronting a badge. He was confronting a woman, a black woman, unarmed with symbols, but fortified with truth. That's what made what came next so devastating and so necessary. Because before the badge reappeared, before the courtroom gasped, and before the news cameras rolled, there was just her. No uniform, no rank, no protection, just Celeste. And that was more than enough. But not everyone saw it that way. Let's talk about the moment the officer didn't pause to ask, he just assumed he had the right. His name was Officer Brad Willis, a veteran on the force nearly 15 years in. He wasn't new. He wasn't reckless. But on that morning in that room, he made a decision that would change everything. It started small. A glance, a tightening of the jaw, the kind of body language that says, "You're not supposed to be here." Brad noticed Celeste standing confidently by the third bench on the left. No badge, no escort, no clipboard or courtroom file in hand. Just standing. And in his mind, that meant trouble. He didn't ask who she was, didn't greet her, didn't verify anything. Instead, he walked straight over, hand resting on his belt, voice clipped and loud. "Ma'am, you're going to need to step outside." Celeste turned to him, calm. "I have a right to be here." He cut her off. "I said step outside. Now." It was the kind of moment that happens faster than it registers. When power unchecked goes on autopilot, and prejudice, whether admitted or not, takes the wheel. Brad didn't see a fellow officer. He didn't see someone who might have authority equal to or greater than his own. He saw a woman who didn't look like she belonged. And that was enough. So he reached out, grabbed her by the forearm. Not hard, but not gently either. Not with permission, not with respect. And the room stayed quiet. No one said a word. Because when power moves, most people freeze. But Celeste didn't. She didn't yell. She didn't flinch. She just stood there still and firm, as if her very stillness was louder than anything she could have said. And that's what shook Brad most, that she didn't act afraid. You see, authority gets used to being obeyed. And when it isn't, when someone holds their ground quietly, it rattles the cage. What Brad didn't realize was that this wasn't about procedure. It was about perception. He had no protocol for what to do when the woman he was removing was the sheriff. And no training had prepared him for what happens when the person you try to control controls the whole department. The mistake wasn't just the action, it was the assumption. The unspoken logic that said she's black. She's not in uniform, she's standing alone. She must be a problem. That formula has played out in far too many places. At a Starbucks in Philadelphia. At Yale when a black student was napping in her dorm lounge. Even in the halls of Congress when security questioned elected officials in their own building. It's not always violence. Sometimes it's just the quiet violence of being constantly questioned. The lesson here is simple but heavy. When you hold power, assuming is never neutral. It's dangerous. And for Brad, that assumption was about to unravel his career in front of everyone. Because in the next few seconds, Celeste was going to say 5 words that would flip the entire courtroom. Words that would turn silence into shock and arrogance into apology. Let's step into that moment. The moment Officer Brad Willis grabbed her arm, the entire courtroom paused. Not physically, but emotionally, like a room that suddenly forgot how to breathe. The bailiff glanced over but stayed put. A junior clerk behind the bench looked up, then buried her eyes back in the paperwork. Even one of the defense attorneys, someone who had argued passionately just an hour earlier, shifted in his seat and said nothing. It wasn't confusion. It was choice. No one spoke up, not because they didn't see, but because they didn't want to see. There's a name for that. It's called the bystander effect, a psychological phenomenon where people remain passive in a moment of crisis, especially when others are watching too. Everyone assumes someone else will step in, so no one does. But in rooms like this, rooms built on justice and law, silence doesn't feel passive, it feels complicit, because every person who stayed quiet in that moment was protecting the system, not the person. They were protecting their roles, their routines, their sense of safety within the hierarchy. Because speaking up against a uniform, even one behaving badly, can feel like threatening the whole chain of command, especially if the person being grabbed isn't someone you think has power. Celeste felt it. Not just the grip on her arm, but the weight of everyone else's silence. And she'd felt it before. She once told a story about being pulled over late at night as a rookie officer. She showed her ID, spoke calmly, but the two senior cops kept their hands on their weapons the whole time. She said the part that stayed with her most wasn't the guns. It was the look in their eyes like they didn't care if she was one of them. And worse, that if something happened, no one would stop it. That's what silence does. It teaches people where they stand, and more dangerously, where they don't. We often talk about courage like it's something grand, shouting, marching, changing laws. But sometimes courage is just a whisper, a hand raised, a voice that says, wait, that's not right. No one offered Celeste that voice, not in that moment. And while Officer Willis was absolutely wrong, he wasn't alone in his failure. The room failed too. When you stay silent in the face of wrongdoing, you may not wear the badge, but you help it misfire. And just when it seemed like the system would stay silent forever, Celeste finally spoke. 5 quiet words. That changed everything. Let's hear them together. For a moment, you could hear the hum of the ceiling fan. Celeste didn't raise her voice. She didn't pull away. She just looked Officer Brad Willis in the eyes and said 5 calm words. I am the county sheriff. Silence fell again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Not indifference, not detachment, but disbelief. Brad blinked, confused, almost like he hadn't heard her correctly, like his brain was trying to fit that sentence into a version of reality he didn't recognize. He let go of her arm, slowly, stiffly. What did you say? He asked, voice suddenly smaller. She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer, pulled out a leather wallet, flipped it open with 2 fingers. There, glinting under the courthouse lights, was the gold star-shaped badge with her name, title, and jurisdiction. Sheriff Celeste Morgan, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the entire county. Higher than him, higher than anyone else in the room. It was as if the entire courtroom tilted in that moment, the weight of assumptions suddenly crashing into the truth. One clerk gasped. The bailiff stepped forward, face pale. Even the judge sitting behind the bench leaned forward as if trying to make sure what he was seeing was real. Because when a system is built on hierarchy and symbols, the wrong person wearing the right badge can short-circuit the entire chain of command. And that's exactly what just happened. Celeste didn't gloat, didn't demand an apology. She simply tucked her badge away, adjusted her sleeve, and took a deep breath, as if she'd been holding it in for years. The truth is, her badge hadn't changed, their perception had. And that's the part worth paying attention to. Because the only thing that made her powerful in their eyes was the object she held in her hand. Not the wisdom in her voice, not the steadiness in her presence, not the years she had risked her life in service. Just a badge. It brings to mind a viral story from a few years ago, an airline passenger demanding that a black woman move seats, assuming she was in the wrong row. Turns out the woman was a federal judge. When she stood up and stated her position, the man went pale. The internet called it satisfying. She called it exhausting. Because when your legitimacy only registers once it's proven, you spend your life preparing to prove it instead of simply being allowed to live it. That day in court, Celeste didn't just reveal her badge. She revealed the cracks in the system, cracks built not on rules but on bias. And in that moment, she didn't just reclaim her authority, she reclaimed her dignity in front of every single person who tried to take it away without a word. Respect rooted in assumptions can vanish in seconds, but respect earned through truth that's unshakable. And the truth was now public. There was no going back. But if you thought the moment was over, you'd be wrong, because the fallout hadn't even begun. Let's talk about what happened next when the system, now exposed, had to answer for itself. It didn't take long. By the time Celeste left the courtroom that afternoon, the story was already on Twitter. A courtroom witness had quietly filmed the entire interaction on their phone. The moment the officer grabbed her, the moment she pulled out the badge, the moment the room changed. Within hours, it had gone viral. Local news picked it up first, then regional outlets, then national platforms. Black sheriff mistaken for defendant, confronts officer in courtroom shakeup. The headline practically wrote itself. But what followed wasn't just media buzz. It was a reckoning. The county's Internal Affairs Division launched an immediate investigation into Officer Brad Willis. The mayor's office held a press conference by morning. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse holding signs that read, "You assumed wrong. Power has a new face. Respect is not negotiable." People weren't just angry at the officer. They were angry at the silence, the complicity, the system that allowed that moment to feel normal until it became news. Departments across the state started reviewing their internal bias training policies. Sheriff Morgan, now reluctantly thrust into the public spotlight, began receiving requests for interviews, advisory roles, and keynote appearances. But through it all, she stayed grounded. In one interview, she said, "This wasn't about me being the sheriff. It was about how I was treated when no one knew I was." That struck a chord, because it's easy for institutions to say we support diversity or we stand with our officers. But moments like this peel back the surface and reveal the habits beneath. It reminded many of the case in Georgia where a black prosecutor was mistaken for a defendant in her own courtroom, not once but twice in 1 week. No badge could protect her from how people had been taught to see her. So when Celeste chose not to press charges against Officer Willis but instead called for structural reform, people paid attention. She could have demanded suspension. She could have demanded termination. And the system probably would have given it to her. But she chose something harder. She asked for accountability without vengeance. She asked for every department in the county to undergo mandatory bias training, for clearer use of authority protocols in all public government buildings, for a review board that included civilian oversight, something the department had resisted for years. And perhaps most significantly, she asked for every deputy under her command to read and reflect on the encounter not as a disciplinary act, but as a cultural mirror. Because true reform doesn't start with a press release. It starts with a willingness to look in the mirror and say, "We got this wrong, and we need to do better." That's not weakness, that's leadership. Real power isn't about control, it's about the courage to correct yourself before someone else has to. And while the system had begun to bend, Celeste wasn't finished. Because now that the world was watching, she wasn't going to let this become just another headline. She had a story to tell. Not about the moment she was disrespected, but about the journey that made her ready for it. Let's go back and meet the woman before the badge. Celeste never asked to be a symbol. She didn't step into that courtroom to make a statement. She wasn't looking for applause or headlines or hashtags. She came for a procedural review, something she'd done dozens of times. But now the world had seen her in a different light. Not just as a sheriff, not just as a black woman in leadership, but as a mirror reflecting back everything we still hadn't fixed. At first, she hesitated to speak. When the media requests flooded in, she turned them down. But then the emails started. From young black girls in law school, from community activists, from retired officers who had watched the video and whispered, "I've seen that happen too." But I never had the courage to say anything. That changed something in her. Celeste realized this moment wasn't just about her experience. It was about what it exposed. And if she didn't speak now, someone else might suffer in silence later. So she stood up, not in uniform, not behind a podium with flashing badges beside her, but in front of a small town hall surrounded by folding chairs and worn carpet, speaking to a room of ordinary people who needed to feel seen. Her voice was calm but steady. What happened to me is not new. What's new is that it was caught on camera, and that I have the privilege and platform to respond. She didn't villainize Officer Willis. She didn't generalize the force. Instead, she talked about patterns that started in silence, grew in policy, and were allowed to survive through culture. She laid out a reform plan, mandatory bias training, not once a year but quarterly, community-led advisory boards for all precincts in the county, anonymous reporting channels for law enforcement misconduct, and perhaps most powerfully, a mentorship program for young women of color interested in public service. This wasn't a speech, it was a blueprint. It reminded people of other turning points, like when former police chief Carmen Best in Seattle chose to step down rather than compromise ethics, or when Letitia James in New York publicly investigated her own state's institutions. Celeste didn't just speak about justice, she embodied it, firm but not angry, hopeful but not naive. In an interview with NPR, she was asked, "What gives you the strength to keep showing up?" She smiled and answered simply, "Because someone like me had to walk in first, so someone else wouldn't have to explain why they deserve to be there." Leadership isn't born in applause. It's born in quiet decisions to act when no one expects you to. And now that Celeste had stepped into the light, people began to ask, where did she come from? How did she get here? To understand that you have to go back, before the badge, before the courtroom, back to the girl who grew up in the quiet corner of a loud world and decided early on that if the system wouldn't protect her, one day she'd be the system. Let's meet that Celeste, before the courtroom, before the badge, before the headlines and microphones and press conferences. There was just Celeste, a little girl growing up in Eastwood County in a brick duplex that always smelled faintly of cornbread and lemon polish. Her mother was a public school teacher, her father a sanitation worker who came home every day with sore hands and a quiet pride. They didn't have much, but they had values. Celeste was the kind of child who asked hard questions early. At 6, she asked her mother why the police in their neighborhood looked so angry. At 10, she asked why some classmates were told to watch their tone more than others. At 13, she watched her older brother get stopped by police walking home from basketball practice, no reason given. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with her father and asked, if they don't protect us, who does her father put down his fork and looked her in the eye? Sometimes, baby, we have to grow up and become the protection. That sentence never left her. It followed her through college, through endless hours at the police academy, where she was one of just 3 women in her class and the only black recruit. It followed her through years of patrol, being mistaken for a secretary at precinct meetings, having to prove again and again that she earned her stripes. Celeste didn't rise through the ranks because someone opened the door for her. She rose because she learned how to keep knocking even when no one answered, and she never forgot where she came from. Every month, even after being appointed sheriff, she would visit a different high school in the county, not to give speeches, but to sit, to listen, to remind kids who looked like her that their voices mattered. She once told a student, "They may call you loud, they may call you difficult, but don't ever let them convince you that silence is safer." That's who Celeste Morgan really is. Not a uniform, not a title, but a woman shaped by the weight of injustice and determined not to pass it on. The badge didn't make her powerful, it simply gave her a platform, one she was never going to waste. Because to her, leadership wasn't about command, it was about responsibility. True authority doesn't come from being feared, it comes from being trusted. And as the world began to understand who Celeste was, the courtroom incident became more than a headline. It became a moment, a turning point, a verdict not from a judge but from the people. But what did the system learn? Let's step back into that courtroom one last time to witness the verdict that no one expected. There was no gavel, no formal ruling, no official sentence handed down. But make no mistake, a verdict was delivered that day. And it didn't come from the judge. It came from the room. After Celeste revealed her badge and the truth settled in like dust on old furniture, something subtle but powerful shifted in the air. The people who had looked away began to look inward. The clerk who stayed silent later submitted a formal apology. The judge who had remained seated watching it all unfold met with Celeste privately and admitted, "I should have intervened. I was afraid of disrupting the order of the court. But what I failed to realize is that order without justice is just silence in a robe. That moment echoed beyond four courtroom walls. Law students began discussing the incident in ethics classes. Church groups used it in sermons about standing up even when your voice shakes. And in one precinct across the county, a junior officer requested to revise their protocol manual to include a line about verifying before assuming. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was real, and it was a start. Because sometimes the most meaningful reforms don't begin with legislation, they begin with reflection. The truth is everyone in that room learned something that day. Some learned that titles don't always come with uniforms. Others learned that their silence could scream louder than words. And a few, like Officer Brad Willis, learned that power granted can be power revoked. He was placed on administrative leave, not out of revenge, but accountability. When asked later how she felt about his punishment, Celeste answered with grace, "What matters to me isn't what he lost. It's what the system gained. A clearer mirror, a sharper conscience, and hopefully, a shorter leash on unchecked bias." That answer said everything, because Celeste wasn't just walking into that courtroom as a sheriff. She was walking in as a test, and the system failed at first, but it also got a chance to listen, to learn, to change. Justice isn't just a verdict, it's a ripple. It moves through people, through policy, through culture. And that ripple had only just begun, because the story didn't end there. Celeste had something else in mind, something far beyond one courtroom, one county, or even one incident. She wasn't just rewriting perception. She was building a legacy. Let's see what that legacy looks like and what it means for all of us. Celeste never intended to be the center of attention, but once the spotlight found her, she chose to use it to light a path forward. Rather than fade quietly into her role, she leaned into the moment, not for recognition but for responsibility. She launched a local initiative called Open Doors, a program designed to bring students of color into spaces they'd never been invited to, before ride-alongs with deputies, tours of courtrooms, roundtable talks with judges and city officials. Not just to inspire them, but to let them envision themselves there. She helped form a county-wide civilian oversight board made up of teachers, social workers, retired nurses, pastors, the kinds of people who live with the consequences of bad policing, but rarely have a voice in how law enforcement operates. She even went one step further. With the help of a nonprofit grant, Celeste started a leadership academy for young women of color interested in law, public safety, and civic service. Every session began with the same words: "You don't have to change who you are to lead, but you do have to be willing to stand even when you're the only one standing." Those girls didn't just listen, they took notes, they asked questions, and every time they looked at her, they didn't just see a sheriff, they saw a future where they belonged. One of her students, a 17-year-old named Maya, recently gave a speech at her high school. People used to say, "Justice wears a blindfold." But maybe she shouldn't. Maybe justice needs to look us in the eye and see us fully. Celeste was in the front row, and yes, she cried. Her story didn't end in a courtroom. It began there. But its true power came from what followed: the conversations, the programs, the minds she opened, the systems she quietly rewrote. Because sometimes change doesn't look like a revolution. It looks like a meeting that runs longer than expected, a policy revised, a mind reconsidered, a young girl deciding to stay in the room even when the room doesn't seem built for her. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build while you're still here. And Celeste Morgan isn't finished. Not by a long shot. So if you've ever been mistaken for less than who you are, if you've ever been talked over, passed by, or told to wait your turn, this story's yours too. Because sometimes justice doesn't just arrive in a robe or a badge. Sometimes she walks in quietly, gets mistaken for someone else, and ends up changing everything. If this story moved, you share it. Because the more we tell the truth, the harder it becomes to ignore. And if you believe in stories that hold power, accountable, subscribe to That Person Was Me, for more true moments of justice, dignity, and voices that refuse to be silenced.